30 pieces of silver. That was the price. That number wasn't random. It was the exact sum the law of Moses established as the minimum compensation when your ox accidentally kills someone's servant. The lowest category of human life the law recognized. The temple priests chose it deliberately, a theological statement disguised as a transaction. And I walked out of that meeting with those coins in my hand, thinking I had made a decision. I hadn't understood yet that the decision had already been made about me. Before I go further, the voice you are hearing is a dramatic reconstruction built on scripture, archaeology, and documented history, assisted by artificial intelligence and reviewed for theological accuracy. The words are not in any gospel. The weight behind them is. If you've ever managed something sacred without letting it touch you, I need you to tell me in the comments, because that's exactly what this is about. The last thing I touched was his face. Not a weapon, not a bag of coins, his face, with my hands, and then with my lips, the way I'd greeted him 100 times before. The way you greet someone after a long road when you are genuinely glad to see them. Except this time, the soldiers were behind me. It was dark. The Garden of Gethsemane smelled of olive oil and turned soil and cold stone. The specific coldness that comes before dawn when even the insects have gone quiet. Torches lit from below, which is not how you carry light when you're looking for a friend. A crowd of men with swords and clubs, sent by the chief priests and the elders of the people. I walked ahead of them. That was the arrangement. I would approach first, greet him, and the one I kissed, that would be the man. As if they couldn't recognize him. As if they hadn't watched him teach in the temple courts for days in front of hundreds. The signal wasn't for their benefit. I understand that now. The signal was for mine. It forced me to put my hands on him, to make the transaction physical, to close every door I'd left open. He saw me coming across the garden. He let me come. I said, "Rabbi," and I kissed him. And he said, "Friend, do what you came to do." Friend. He called me friend in the moment I was handing him to armed men. Not traitor, not the name for what I had done. Friend, the way you say something when you've decided it's true regardless of what happens next. I couldn't answer him. I had prepared nothing for that word. But if you think this story starts in that garden, if you think the man who walked into Gethsemane with soldiers was the same man Jesus chose 3 years earlier, you are missing the entire structure of what happened. And you will leave thinking this is a story about someone else. Go back further. Jesus spent an entire night in prayer before choosing us. Not an hour, the whole night, alone on a mountain, asking. And at dawn he came down and called 12 men by name. My name was on that list. He knew what he was choosing. That is the fact that has never left me. He saw the night through, whatever he asked in those dark hours, and the answer that came back at dawn included Judas Iscariot. I was not an accident of proximity. I was chosen by name after a night of prayer. You're allowed to wrestle with that. I still am. We were given authority, power transferred from one person to another, to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to cleanse lepers, to drive out demons. I walked into villages I had never seen and laid hands on people who were suffering, and they recovered. I sat with the others in the evenings when the fire was low and the talk was slow and good, and we were tired from walking, and we believed in what we were doing. I was there for all of it, and I held the money. This matters more than people realize. The group had a common fund, shared expenses, provisions, giving to those in need. Jesus could have given the responsibility to Peter, to Matthew, the former tax collector who understood Roman accounting. He gave it to me. Every coin that moved through that group passed through my hands first. He was a thief. Not, he became a thief. He was, present continuous. While healing the sick in the name of Jesus, while sitting at those fires, while watching Lazarus walk out of a sealed tomb wrapped in grave linen. The money was moving, not enough to notice, enough to maintain the habit, enough to make the habit feel like a right. This is what was rotting before anything else happened. There is a scene that no sermon I have ever heard stops to examine. I think it is the hinge of everything. Bethany, 6 days before Passover. The house of Simon, a man Jesus had healed. Mary was there, the sister of Lazarus. She came in with an alabaster jar. The smell reached the room before anyone understood what she was doing. Nard, pure nard imported, sealed in stone because air degrades it. 300 denarii, a laborer's 12 months of work, in one container. She broke the jar and poured it over his feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the fragrance expanded through the entire room immediately, the way enormous things always announce themselves without asking permission. There was a moment where no one spoke, and then I spoke. Why wasn't this sold and given to the poor? 300 denarii. That would have helped a great many people. It was a reasonable question. It was exactly what a responsible treasurer should raise. I felt genuine conviction as I said it. It was also a lie. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. There it is, named. The indignation I felt watching 300 denarii dissolve into scent on a stone floor. It was not moral outrage. It was the reflex of a man watching resources he had mentally categorized go somewhere he could not reach. My righteousness was arithmetic. My concern for the poor was a habit I'd borrowed from proximity to Jesus, without examining what it cost me to hold it. Jesus answered me in front of everyone. He said, "Leave her alone. She kept this for the day of my burial. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me." Burial. 6 days before Passover. He said it in the present tense. And he looked. I have never known who he was looking at when he said it. The room, Mary. But I was standing there with the question still in the air, and the word burial landed, and something in the sentence felt aimed inward rather than outward. I have asked myself that longer than I can measure. Did he know? At that dinner in Bethany, with the nard still heavy in the air and the broken jar on the floor, did he already know what was forming in me? I don't know, but I heard it. And something closed in me after Bethany, a door I hadn't consciously recognized as a door. The way the sky changes before a storm, and you don't notice until it's already a different color. Within days, I went to the chief priests. I asked what they would give me to hand him over. They counted out 30 pieces of silver. And now I need you to understand what 30 pieces of silver actually was. Because if you think this was a significant sum, if you picture something that even begins to justify the weight of what I did, you have the number completely wrong. And the number is the part that changes everything. 30 pieces of silver. Say it slowly. Let the number sit. In the book of Exodus, Moses established the legal compensation for accidental death. Specifically, the minimum payment owed when your ox gored another man's slave. Not a person of standing, not a citizen, a slave. The lowest category of human life recognized by the law. That payment was 30 shekalim of silver. That was the offer on the table. The chief priests did not name that number randomly. They were temple scholars. They knew every layer of the text the way a surgeon knows anatomy. When they counted out 30 pieces of silver, they were making a theological declaration before the trial had started. This man is worth the minimum legal compensation for a dead slave. This is what we assess his life to be, and I accepted it. But there is one more layer to the coins themselves that almost no one mentions. The 30 pieces were not common Roman currency. They were Tyrian shekels, minted in Tyre, highest silver content in circulation, the only denomination the temple treasury accepted for religious payments. Every worshipper arriving in Jerusalem for Passover had to exchange their Roman coins for Tyrian shekels at the money-changing tables in the outer courts. Those were the tables Jesus had overturned months earlier, scattering coins across the pavement, driving out the merchants with a whip he'd braided himself. The money they used to buy my cooperation was the sacred currency of the system he had attacked. And Zechariah had written it centuries before. A shepherd rejected by the flock, told to name his price, handed 30 pieces of silver, and God says, "That is the handsome price at which they valued me. Throw it to the potter in the house of the Lord." The potter, the house of the Lord. I will come back to that. There are 4 days between the meeting with the priests and the Passover meal. I did not withdraw. I did not warn Jesus, which I could have done in a dozen private moments across those 4 days. I held the information and kept moving toward what I had agreed to do. Every hour I didn't undo the agreement made undoing it feel more costly than continuing. I had walked into that meeting. To withdraw would require me to look directly at what I had done. And looking at it was the one thing those 4 days were structured to avoid. I kept moving. The Passover meal. The room had been prepared in advance. Jesus had sent Peter and John ahead with specific instructions. A furnished upper room, everything ready. By the time the rest of us arrived, the lamps were lit, the lamb had been slaughtered, the bitter herbs were on the table. 13 men in a space that smelled of roasted meat and wine, and the particular tension of a group that can feel something wrong without being able to name it. Jesus took his place. We reclined around him on our left sides, as free men do at Passover, not as slaves. Then he said it. "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." The room fractured into individual panic. One by one, "Surely not I, surely not I." Peter signaled John, who was closest to Jesus, to ask who it was. John leaned in. Jesus answered quietly, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it." He dipped the bread. He held it out. To me. He looked at me when he handed it over. I know what I saw in that look. I have replayed it more times than I can account for. It was not condemnation. It was not the face of someone pronouncing judgment. It was something harder to carry than either of those. The look of someone extending something for the last time, fully aware it will be refused, extending it anyway. He said, "What you are going to do it quickly." No one else understood. They assumed I was being sent on an errand, to buy what was needed for the festival, or to give something to the poor. Only he and I knew what the instruction meant. I took the bread, I stood, I left, and it was night. The garden was not far, 20 minutes of walking through streets thick with Passover pilgrims. I had told the priests where to find him, not an address, but a pattern. I knew his habits. He went often to Gethsemane. That is the kind of knowledge that accumulates over 3 years of walking beside someone. The things we know about the people we are close to can be used in many directions. We reached the garden. He was there. I walked toward him, and in the 2 seconds between seeing his face and beginning to move, in those 2 seconds I saw something I have never been able to use correctly. He was not surprised, not performing calm, not bracing for impact. Fully present, occupying that moment, that ground, that air, as if the garden were exactly where he had intended to be, as if everything about to happen were proceeding according to something I had no access to. And I moved toward him anyway. The arrest was quick. Peter drew a sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant, Malchus, the kind of specific name that survives only in eyewitness accounts. Jesus touched the man's ear and healed it in the same moment he was being arrested. Then they bound him and led him away, and the disciples scattered, just as Jesus had said they would, just as Zechariah had written about the shepherd being struck and the sheep dispersing. And I stood there, with 30 Tyrian shekels. The cost arrived before dawn, not the obvious cost. The obvious cost came later, the field, the rope, the ending recorded in different physical details, but the same direction. The cost that arrived before dawn, while the lamps were still burning in the rooms where the questioning was happening, was this. I understood that I had been wrong about what I was selling. I had spent 3 years watching this man. I had concluded somewhere in those years that what he was doing could be managed, that the kingdom he spoke of was a project with levers I could anticipate, that I could position myself correctly, and whether the movement succeeded or failed, I would have navigated it well. I had treated the infinite like a resource I was administering, and in the courtyard before dawn, I understood what I had actually handed over. Not a political leader, not a miracle worker who could be managed, something I had no category for, and my absence of category had cost me the one thing I'd been managing without realizing it was mine to lose. The next morning I went back to the priests. I threw the 30 pieces of silver into the temple. I said, "I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood." They said, "What is that to us? That's your responsibility." 30 pieces of Tyrian silver scattered across the temple floor. The sacred currency of the house of God, lying on the stones, untouchable, because even the men who had authorized the payment could not put blood money back into the treasury. They used it instead to buy a field from a potter, to bury foreigners in. The potter, the house of the Lord. Everything Zechariah had written played out in the sequence he had written it, using the people who had memorized Zechariah to do it. I had been, from the beginning, a detail in a story I thought I was managing. I have had 2,000 years to think about the difference between Peter and me. Not the theological difference, the simple human difference between two men who both failed on the same night and then did two different things with the morning. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, to a servant girl and to bystanders, with the fire at his back, escalating to cursing and swearing. Then the rooster crowed, and Jesus turned and looked at him from across the courtyard, and Peter went outside and wept bitterly. He wept. He went outside. He was still moving. I went to the priests. I threw the money. I said what I said. And then I went to a field and I did not come back. The difference was not the magnitude of the failure. Peter's 3 denials were not smaller than my betrayal. The man he denied was the same man I sold, and Peter had more warning. Jesus had told him directly, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. He was warned and failed anyway. He failed with full information. The difference was the conclusion we each drew from what we had done. Peter concluded, "I have failed. I need to go back." I concluded, "What I have done is too large to survive. There is no back." And that conclusion, not the betrayal, but the verdict I issued on myself after the betrayal, is the thing I cannot defend. Because I had watched Jesus raise a man who had been dead for 4 days. I was there when Lazarus walked out of a sealed tomb, still wrapped in grave cloth, blinking in the afternoon light. I had seen with my own eyes what this man did with things that were finished, and I decided my situation was beyond him. That is the specific place where I went wrong. Not Bethany, not the meeting with the priests, not the garden. Here, in the gap between feeling remorse and choosing what to do with it, I decided that the person who could restore the dead could not reach what I had done. I exempted myself from the one thing I had seen him do consistently. I chose an ending before he could offer one. The truth that has taken me the entire length of this account to arrive at is not a moral about betrayal. It is something more particular and more uncomfortable than that. Proximity is not the same as surrender. I was close to Jesus for 3 years in the way that someone can be close to fire and remain cold, not because the fire is insufficient, but because you have learned to stand close enough to see it without letting it touch you. I administered the resources of a movement I never fully joined. I performed its works. I inhabited its language. I was, by every external measure, a committed participant. And I maintained, underneath all of that, a separate account. A private ledger where I tracked what the movement was costing me versus what I was getting from it. Where I monitored the gap between what Jesus was promising and what I could see arriving. Where I kept the option of exit quietly available, the way you keep a door unlocked you tell yourself you'll never use. That private account is what the money was really about, not the 30 coins. The habit of treating everything, including what was sacred, as a resource I was authorized to assess and redirect. The theft was not the corruption. It was the symptom. The corruption was the posture, always the administrator, never the recipient. Always the one holding the bag, deciding where things went, never the one who put everything down and said, "I don't know what this is, but I'm inside it now, and I'm not managing it anymore." Peter put everything down in a courtyard in complete panic, and it looked like failure. And Jesus built the church on that foundation. I kept the bag in my hands until the end. You don't need to have handed anyone over to soldiers in a garden at night to recognize what I am describing. You know what it looks like to be adjacent to something true without letting it change you. You've sat in rooms, services, conversations with people clearly living from a place you couldn't access, and observed what they had without moving toward it. Because moving toward it would require putting down something you were holding. And what you were holding was the version of yourself that knew how to assess situations, manage exposure, keep the ledger. The person who volunteers because it looks good and skims something from the process. The theology student who can argue every position on grace and has never felt it land. The person in a relationship for years who has never been fully present, who maintains always a slight managerial distance, watching from the position of someone who could exit rather than someone who has entered. The leader who can move crowds and cannot be moved. The frightening possibility is not that Judas was uniquely evil. It is that Judas was unusually skilled. He managed proximity to holiness without contamination for 3 years. That takes a specific kind of discipline, the discipline of keeping yourself at the administrative level, never permitting descent into the thing itself. Most of us practice that discipline in smaller rooms, but the structure is the same. The 30 coins were not the temptation. The 30 coins were the proof that the real transaction had already happened long before. When I decided that what moved through my hands did not have to move through me. The word for what I felt when I returned the money is metamelomai in Greek, remorse. Not the same word as metanoia, repentance, transformation. They feel identical from the inside. They produce completely different outcomes. Metamelomai says, "I feel the weight of what I did." Metanoia says, "I feel the weight, and I am going toward the only person who can do something about it." I felt the weight. I issued my verdict. I closed the account. Peter felt the weight, and he ran toward a sealed tomb on Sunday morning. The next figure in this series carries a different kind of failure, quieter, more patient, dressed entirely in righteousness. No garden, no soldiers, no coins you can count, just a slow erosion from the inside, in a man God had trusted with more than almost anyone in his generation. Before that account begins, I want to ask you something. Not about me, about you. Is there something you are administering right now that you were meant to receive? There is a comment section below this video. The people who read it this far are the kind of people who are worth being honest with. If you know what I mean, you already know.